Today's lesson will be on controls and control groups, what they are and what they're used for in psychological research. What is the purpose of controls, first of all? Well, controls basically are put in place to prevent extraneous variables affecting your dependent variable. The only thing which you want to affect your dependent variable is your independent variable, so that your results will be both reliable and valid. So controls are put in place to make sure that your results are valid and reliable. There are different types of variables which we must control for in research. The first are participant variables, then we have situational or environmental variables and experimenter variables, and we're going to look at one of the core studies and consider how such variables were controlled to make sure that results were reliable and valid. The study that we're going to consider is McGuire's 2000 study, which looked at navigation-related structural changes in the hippocampi of taxi drivers. In this study, McGuire took MRI scans of the brains of 16 London black taxi drivers and compared them to scans of non-taxi drivers. McGuire had a number of controls in place. First of all, the taxi drivers were subjected to a number of tests before they took place. All of the taxi drivers were deemed to be healthy as regards medical, psychiatric and neurological tests. So they also, in the control group, the non-taxi drivers had similar profiles. That's one way that they were matched. The other way that they were matched or controlled was that the control group also comprised of males. That's the symbol for males, in case you didn't know. And the taxi drivers and the control group were all right-handed. The taxi drivers were scanned using an MRI scanner, and the control group scans were taken from the same unit where the MRI scans for the taxi drivers were completed, to ensure that there were no variances in the machines that were used, etc. So that was all standardised. By having these controls in place, McGuire was able to control as much as possible that the taxi drivers and non-taxi drivers were similar in many ways, apart from the fact that one group were taxi drivers and the other group were non-taxi drivers. So we have the healthy, psychiatric, neurological and medical profiles. They were all male. The scanners from the same unit were used. They were all right-handed, and all this ensured that they were matched. So that reduces participant variables. The experimenter variable that was controlled was that the person who was responsible for the pixel counting from the scans to measure the volume of grey matter in the anterior and posterior hippocampi was blind, and that meant that the pixel counter didn't know if the scans that they were looking at were from a taxi driver or a non-taxi driver, so that there would be no experimenter bias. So to recap, we have the participant variables that were controlled were gender, the medical, psychiatric and neurological profiles, the fact that they were right-handed. They were also for a similar range of ages. The situational variable that was controlled was that the same MRI scanners were used. And lastly, the experimenter variable that was controlled was the fact that the pixel counter was blind. What I would like you to do for your written task then today is to take Sperry's study, and I want you to write down as many of the controls which Sperry used to ensure that the procedure was standardised and wasn't going to be affected by any extraneous variables. So find as many controls as you can for Sperry's study. The next thing we're going to look at are control groups. Usually in a study, an experiment, you will have an experimental group and you will have a control group. The experimental group is subjected to the independent variable. So for example, if you were testing the effectiveness on a drug, say on depression, your experimental group would be given the drug that was on trial, and your control group would be given a placebo. So they wouldn't be receiving the actual drug, which was the independent variable. And in that way then you can compare the results for your experimental group and your control group. And a number of the core studies that we have looked at have used control groups, and we're going to look at two of them now. The first is McGuire. Now, as I already said, McGuire had 16 male right-handed taxi drivers, and the control group in that study were the scans from 50 right-handed males. So McGuire was able to compare the scans from the two groups to see if being a taxi driver had an effect on the dependent variable, which was the volume of grey matter in the posterior hippocampus. And of course, McGuire found that the taxi drivers had a greater volume of grey matter in the posterior hippocampus and a smaller anterior hippocampus, and the reverse was true for the control group. Sperry then, if you remember, carried out a series of tasks, visual and tactile tasks, on 11 people who had had their hemispheres deconnected. In other words, their corpus callosum had been severed because of their epilepsy, and that was to prevent or lessen the fits that they experienced as part of their condition, as part of their epilepsy. So Sperry conducted the tests on these 11 participants, and then also had a control group of 11 people who had not undergone the operation, to see a comparison between the two groups and the differences in how they did on the tasks. Now, there have been criticisms of Sperry's control group. Sperry used 11 people, however they were not 11 people with epilepsy, so it probably would have been better if Sperry had looked at 11 people with epilepsy who had not had their hemispheres deconnected, because the fact that those people in the control group did not have epilepsy may be a confounding variable and affect the results. So it would have been better if the control group were better matched to the original group. What I would like you to do is to think of one more of the studies which has a control group, and I want you to write down what the control group was and why this group was selected for comparison purposes. And that is your lesson. So you have two writing tasks. One, to write down the controls in Sperry's study, as many as you can think of. And the other is to think of a third core study which also used a control group. And that's it.